Welcome to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This lecture is intended for students enrolled in the Academy's Classical Rhetoric course. If you're not enrolled and would like to join us for self-paced studies, visit classicalliberalarts.com. My name is William Michael. I'm the Academy Headmaster, and I'll be leading this study of Chapter 1 of Book 1 of Aristotle's Rhetoric. We're studying the opening chapter of Aristotle's Rhetoric, which was written by the great philosopher who lived from 384 to 322 and supposedly composed this work around 350 BC. 350 BC. This work, the Rhetoric, is Aristotle's attempt to treat the art of persuasion in a systematic way. He is working to provide a scientific foundation for effective and ethical communication. Remember, his concern in the ethics is to promote the common good through political science. The art of rhetoric is the art of communication that makes that civic life possible. This first chapter serves as the foundation for the entire work by defining the nature of rhetoric and defending its legitimacy as an art. We'll see the problem that Aristotle is trying to solve as he does this. He wants to establish rhetoric as a legitimate art, distinguishing it from emotional manipulation and sophistry. This text has obviously had a profound influence on Catholic education throughout history, as well as scholastic philosophy. And St. Thomas and other medieval scholars recognize rhetoric as a legitimate rational art. In other words, Aristotle's goal has been fulfilled, so long as rhetoric is ordered toward truth and virtue, which was Aristotle's intention. So this is a lengthy reading, and I've provided a recording of the reading of the text in a separate video, which you can make use of if you're interested. So I'm going to skip the reading in this video lesson. And before we get started with the division of the text, let's take a moment to commit our time to the Lord in prayer. Let us pray. Lord our God, in your wisdom and love, you surround us with the mysteries of the universe. Send your Spirit upon us and fill us with your wisdom and blessings. Grant that we may devote ourselves to our studies and draw ever closer to you, the source of all knowledge. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a lengthy reading, and so the division can get a little complicated. We're actually going to identify or mark out 15 parts in this first chapter, and if you use the text that's available on the Academy website, these divisions have already been labeled in the text, but I'll read through them just for the sake of completeness here. The book opens, and again, this is chapter 1 of book 1. The book opens with a discussion of the nature and universality of rhetoric, what rhetoric is and why it's important to all people. This begins right at the beginning where we read, rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic. The second part of the lesson begins where we read, at present, therefore. And in this place, Aristotle criticizes the rhetoricians that were at work in his day. He finds fault with what they're doing, and he says they're causing rhetoric to have a bad name. That's the second part here. The third part begins where he mentions accusation, pity, and anger. He says, for accusation, pity, anger, and so on. Here in this third part, he talks about the problem with mere emotional manipulation and why that's not proper rhetoric. Part 4 begins at for with respect to all cities, where he talks about the need for legal restrictions on talk in speeches that doesn't relate directly to the subject, irrelevant appeals, and so on. He says that cities need to require orators or litigants to stick to the subject, as we see in modern courts. Part 5, the division of labor between a legislator, one who makes the laws, and a judge, one who sits and judges cases that bring questions of the law before the state or the city. This begins at, again, it is likewise manifest. Part 6, where we read, and in the first place, Aristotle explains why legislators are better than judges for dealing with general principles. The seventh part, with respect to other particulars, he talks about what should properly be left to judges to avoid injustice. The eighth part, if then this be the case, he talks about rhetoricians and their focus on techniques that are really irrelevant to the true art of rhetoric. The ninth part begins at hence, though there is, and here he distinguishes between deliberative and judicial rhetoric. Part 10, he talks about the proper focus of rhetoric. He says, since, however, it is evident, beginning this 10th part, 11th through the 14th parts, he gives 4 defenses of rhetoric. Part 11, beginning at but rhetoric is useful, he explains that truth and justice naturally prevail. Truth and justice naturally prevail, and rhetoric is necessary to make sure that that is preserved. The second defense he gives, part 12, begins at farther still, though we should, and he talks about the necessity for popular audiences and why popular speeches are better than judicial speeches. The 13th part, he gives his third defense of the importance of understanding both sides of a contradiction. The 14th part of the chapter, he gives his fourth defense on human dignity and the practical utility of rhetoric. This begins where we read, besides, it is absurd. And then lastly, where we read that rhetoric, therefore, is not conversant. This marks the beginning of the final, 15th part, where he gives a final definition of rhetoric and then concludes the chapter. So a lengthy chapter, a complex division, but that's all marked out in the text on the Academy website. Let's move then into the text itself and work to understand all that we read. And this is intended to be complete or comprehensive for students. And again, since we have a lengthy text, this interpretation is going to be quite lengthy. So remember, as a recorded lecture, you can pause this, you can study it in parts. So I'm going to go on and make a single lecture here, but I'm doing that conscious of the reality that this is a lengthy chapter, and I'm recommending that students take their time, use pause and rewind to go through it at your own pace, take notes as we go, and just take your time working through this. There's a lot of content to process, and being the opening chapter of an important study, this content is important and worthy of our time. So let's get started. The chapter opens, we read, rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic or logic, and dialectic or logic, those are two synonymous terms, not two different ideas. Rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic or logic because both are conversant with such particulars as being common may after a manner be known by all men and pertain to no definite science. So Aristotle begins by establishing rhetoric's fundamental relationship to dialectic. And I would argue that the reason why he does this is because his audience would already be persuaded of the importance of dialectic. And so he's basically saying, look, if you agree that dialectic is important, I want you to realize that rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic. These two arts are related, they're connected to each other. This word reciprocates means that they correspond to one another. They work together as counterparts. So again, he's appealing to the expected acceptance and respect for dialectic and showing that you really can't have one without the other. They're two sides of the same coin, as it were. Both of these arts deal with matters that are common to all people, rather than belonging to some specialized science like astronomy or medicine. These are liberal arts that apply to all men, or are of interest to all men, of the greatest value. And so he's arguing that rhetoric and dialectic work with the kinds of questions and problems that ordinary people encounter in daily life. Questions about what is just and unjust, what's advantageous, what's probably true or not. All common issues, common topics that interest all people, that we participate in naturally, not technical scientific knowledge. So this really is one of the core liberal arts. He says all men, in a certain respect, participate in both of these. For all men, to a certain extent, endeavor to examine and sustain an argument, for example, or to defend and accuse. This is just human behavior, and this is the stuff of rhetoric. Because rhetoric and dialectic deal with common human concerns, everyone naturally engages in both activities, both rhetoric and dialectic. When people examine arguments, defend their positions, or accuse others of wrongdoing, they're using the basic principles of dialectic and rhetoric. This shows that these arts, and this is Aristotle's point here, these arts are rooted in human nature itself. These are human arts. We are rational beings who naturally seek to understand the truth. And not only understand it for ourselves, but remembering our concern for the common good, we seek to know the truth and communicate it to others. This relates, to my Dominican vocation, where the motto is to contemplate and share the fruits of contemplation, to know the truth and to communicate it to others. That's just a natural inclination in human nature. So Aristotle goes on to say, with respect to the multitude, therefore, some people do these things casually, just sort of naturally, by chance. Some people are just naturally persuasive, but others through custom, from habit, that is, through study and practice. Aristotle observes here that most people engage in rhetorical and dialectical activities in two different ways. Some, as I said, randomly by chance. They're just naturally inclined to it. Others who may not be inclined to it, but develop their skill by repeated practice, by study and discipline. And the reason why Aristotle makes this distinction is because it shows that while everyone has a natural capacity for these skills, some become more skilled through experience and practice. And we're going to see why Aristotle thinks that's important. The fact that we can improve our power is a sign for Aristotle that this is actually an art that should be part of our education. It's something that can be studied and practiced and perfected. And that's the goal in the study of the classical liberal arts. He says, because this is possible in both ways, that is by chance and by practice or discipline, it's evident that these particulars may be reduced to a certain method, that there is a method that can be studied and taught. Since people can succeed at rhetoric and dialectic by chance and by practice, this proves that these activities, if we study them and draw out from them the principles, what makes some successful and others unsuccessful, this can be systematized into a teachable method, which is what an art really is. Now, if success were just totally random, like some people were just gifted, or sometimes you got it and sometimes you didn't, then no systematic teaching would be possible. But since practice in this skill improves performance and can be taught, there must be discoverable principles that can be known, can be distilled, laid out into a system, and then taught to numbers of students. So Aristotle here again is working to establish the importance and the legitimacy of rhetoric as one of the liberal arts. He says it's possible to survey the cause why some men render what they assert probable or persuasive, some from custom and others for chance. We can study and understand why some people are persuasive. It's not just a magical power. We can understand why some are persuasive through skill while others may just succeed or appear to succeed occasionally. Or why just certain individuals may be uniquely persuasive or influential. And this Aristotle's scientific approach to understanding persuasion as a phenomenon is what makes rhetoric a genuine art rather than some mere knack or gift, as we commonly say today. He says, all men will acknowledge that a thing of this kind is a work of art, and we can prove that by teaching it and demonstrating it. He appeals to common agreement that systematic, teachable methods are what constitute genuine arts. And we should think about, when we talk about the 7 liberal arts, what's unique about them is that they are systematic, teachable methods that have some desirable and universally valuable effect. Since rhetoric can be systemized and taught, it deserves recognition as a legitimate art, not merely a collection of tricks or natural talent, which is how it was perceived in the ancient world by wise men. They saw persuasion as just sort of like the power of a magician, right? Some people just have this ability, almost like a mental illusion that they use to move other people. And so this leads to Aristotle's criticism of the view that men in his day had of rhetoric and the way that rhetoricians taught the art and spoke about the art, because they had this flawed view of it. He says, at present, those who compose arts of orations, that is, who teach public speaking classes, they explain just a small part of rhetoric. So if you don't like public speaking classes, Aristotle says, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You're not really criticizing rhetoric itself. You're criticizing just a small part of rhetoric, which really isn't even essential to this art. So he criticizes rhetoric teachers that were working in his day and before him. They focus only on these delivery skills or these sophistical tricks, and they ignore what are really the most important elements of this study, those elements which connect rhetoric to dialectic or logic. These teachers, like modern public speaking teachers, they reduced rhetoric to either memorizing certain formats or learning manipulation techniques, way to try to move the audience by appealing to their emotions. Aristotle argues that credibility is the only artificial part of the art of rhetoric. Credibility is the only artificial part of the art of rhetoric, and all the other parts, the stuff that other people focus on, that's just addition. The essential part of the art of rhetoric is credibility, that is, being able to use logical arguments to prove things true or to prove things false. The heart of rhetoric as an art lies in creating credibility, that is, persuading through rational arguments. And we're going to look at this more carefully in the second chapter. Everything else that teachers focus on, like organizing speech, preparing the speech, making emotional appeals, your voice, your appearance, stage presence, all this kind of delivery stuff, all this spectacle, it's merely supplementary. The central concern is credibility that comes from clear, rational arguments. Now, when Aristotle says artificial, he says credibility is the only artificial part of the art. Artificial doesn't have the modern meaning. Sometimes or most of the time, the word artificial is used in the sense of an artificial sweetener, for example, or artificial grass, artificial turf in sports. We think of it as fake. We use the word artificial with a negative idea, that it's fake. But artificial doesn't properly mean fake. What it means is accomplished by human skill. Something is artificial that is made or done by human skill, by human art. So artificial means belonging to human art. It doesn't mean fake. So when he says credibility is really the only artificial part of the art, it's really the only skill. It's really what we should be focused on, what we can do by means of this study and practice of the principles of this art. He says the rhetoricians of the present day, speaking of his day, they don't say anything about enthymemes, which are the substantial part of credibility. And keep an eye on this word enthymemes. We'll get into it in just a minute. The rhetoricians say nothing about enthymemes, which are the substantial part of credibility. Their attention is, for the most part, directed to things that are foreign to the purpose. Those are Aristotle's words. Teachers in Aristotle's day who taught rhetoric, they ignored enthymemes. And this is a new word if you're getting started in rhetoric. You've probably never seen this word before, enthymeme. An enthymeme is a kind of syllogism. So if you've studied logic and have learned about syllogisms, an enthymeme is a kind of syllogism. And obviously we're going to study this in detail in rhetoric. But what I'd like you to know is simply that an enthymeme is a rhetorical syllogism, a syllogism used in the context of rhetoric. An enthymeme is a rhetorical syllogism. And he says that these enthymemes, this kind of syllogism, this is the essential element of rhetorical proof. This is how we prove things in rhetoric. Enthymemes, enthymemes, enthymemes. Make sure you focus on that word. Teachers who don't know what they're doing, he says, they focus on matters that are irrelevant to real persuasion. And this enthymeme is a logical argument adapted for rhetorical situations. It's how we reason, and here's the key. It's how we reason about probable matters. Probable matters, because in practical life, in practical discussions, in arguments, political issues, even legal issues, we're often not sure that something is true. Just because something isn't certain doesn't mean we shouldn't argue about it, because when we have to make decisions, a wise man lives according to what's probable. We don't know, for example, that it's going to rain outside, even if it's cloudy and looks like it's going to rain. We can't be absolutely certain that it's going to rain, but a wise man packs his umbrella because it's probable or even likely that it's going to rain. So a wise man doesn't live only by what is absolutely certain. He also has to make decisions, make laws, make judgments about what is probable. And so rhetorical syllogism, these enthymemes, they relate to logical arguments that are concerned with probable matters. And if you study dialectic in Aristotle's Topics, this is the focus of dialectical reasoning that doesn't start with absolutely certain premises, but can start from probable premises. All of the discussions of Socrates are all dialectical reasoning. He usually asks someone for their opinion, and then, assuming that's a pretty good answer, so it's probable, he then uses that as the starting point or the premise. That's what dialectical reasoning is. And this relates to the art of rhetoric. So if you value dialectic, if you're a fan of Socrates or you like Plato's dialogues, then you can't dismiss the art of rhetoric, Aristotle says. He goes on to say, for accusation, pity, anger, and such passions of the soul, the emotions, these don't pertain to the subject itself. These are off subject. These things really are directed at the judge. And so when people speak about these things, when they make these appeals to emotions or to the passions, they're ignoring the actual subject and targeting their speech at the judge, making emotional appeals to the judge. They try to make the judges angry. They try to make the judges feel pity. They make accusations, and they don't address the actual matter that's being discussed. They make everything personal. They appeal to the judge's person, his own emotions, his own fears, his own desires, and so on. They attempt to manipulate the judge's psychological state and lead him to a favorable conclusion. And Aristotle argues that this has nothing to do, this is not proper for the art of rhetoric. It's problematic because it diverts attention away from the truth. It leads to injustice by appealing or by attempting to manipulate emotions that have nothing to do with the topic at hand. And Aristotle is saying we have to learn to become conscious of this and stop it from taking place by focusing on the true nature of this art of rhetoric. He says, if all judicial processes are conducted in the same manner as they are at present in some cities, especially those that are governed by good laws, these rhetoricians who are at work today wouldn't even have anything to say. If we prevented this manipulation, this sophistry and false arguing in courts and made laws that forbid it, their art wouldn't even leave them with anything to talk about because it's all just this sideshow of emotional appeals. In well-governed cities, and again, we enjoy the benefit of this today, courts don't allow litigants to make emotional appeals. They, if you watch a court show like Perry Mason, which is great, you'll notice that any time that one of the lawyers goes off topic or makes some kind of emotional appeal, the other attorney will object, and the judge will accept or reject the objection. They'll say this is not appropriate for a court. Aristotle was conscious of the need for that kind of control back in 350 BC, which is amazing. He says the courts forbid this kind of appeal to the emotions, this playing with the judge, as it were. And if all courts were operated in this way, fake teachers would be useless. And this shows, he says, that their approach is false. If our courts operate rightly, their approach to the study of rhetoric wouldn't even be useful. He says, some think it is necessary that the laws should thus ordain. But this method is adopted by others, and they forbid rhetoricians to say anything foreign to the purpose. He says, this is how it's done in the Areopagus in Athens. Some cities recognize the need for laws that carefully control speech that is presented in courts. Others implement these kinds of restrictions. The Areopagus was Athens' most respected court. You may have heard that name before because that's where St. Paul speaks to the Athenians in chapter 17 of the book of Acts. In the New Testament, St. Paul delivers a speech in the Areopagus, worth checking out, chapter 17 in the book of Acts. The Areopagus was Athens' most respected court, known for its justice, known for its focus on facts and intolerance for any kind of emotional manipulation or nonsense from the litigants. The Areopagus, Aristotle would argue, provides a good model for how judicial procedures should operate. And he says, in this respect, they think rightly. This is Aristotle's view of how justice should be done. Aristotle believes that we should focus all of our attention on the actual arguments, on the evidence, on the reasons, and so on, and not allow ourselves to get distracted by spectacle or emotions. He's not into special effects, not into characters and personality and celebrity status. He just wants the truth, just the facts, and so on. He says it's not proper to pervert the judge. What are we talking about here? It's not proper to manipulate a judge. Why are we teaching people how to do this? This is not just. This is contrary to the common good. He says this is like making a ruler distorted, which we intend to use to measure things and make things straight. Manipulating a judge's emotion corrupts the whole decision-making process. Aristotle says that this is like bending a ruler and then using it to measure things. The tool is being made unreliable, and that's going to lead to inaccurate measurements, and in the case of the courts, to unjust judgments. Why would we ever allow this to happen? It's contrary to our moral philosophy. Justice, one of the four virtues, requires clear thinking. And emotional manipulation is intended to prevent that kind of clear thinking. He says it's likewise manifest that the only business of the litigant, that is one who is presenting a case or defending either side in the court, a litigant, the only business of the litigant is to show that something either is or is not, or that it has or has not been done. He should just stick to the facts. The speaker's job is simply to demonstrate facts, whether something exists or doesn't exist, whether an action occurred or didn't occur. All attention should be focused on objective reality, not subjective impressions or emotions or opinions, and so on. The courts should be a place of objective, factual, logical judgment. Now we see Aristotle at this point change his focus to the discussion of the legislator, the lawmaker. So we've got these two different roles in society. We've got the judge, and we see the problems with the activity of judges and why it needs to be carefully controlled. And so Aristotle turns his attention to the lawmakers. He says, with respect to such things as the legislator has not defined, so things that the lawmaker fails to address. Whether they are great or small, whether they're just or unjust, these ought to be known by the judge himself. The judge should have this knowledge and be wise. He's not to learn them or be instructed by the litigants. When laws don't specify whether something is serious or not serious, as laws do, differences between felonies and misdemeanors, those things are defined in the laws in a just society. Again, we take a lot of this for granted. But when the laws don't specify whether something is serious or grave or minor, whether it's just or unjust, judges have to use their own wisdom and their understanding of the virtue of justice. Litigants, the people speaking in the court to the judge, they shouldn't be teaching judges these things. So they shouldn't even be speaking in that sort of a way to the judges. And this, again, is why in modern courts, you'll see the litigants refer to the judge as Your Honor. The judge runs the court. No one tells the judge how to think or what to do. The judge controls everything. We take this justice, as unjust as we may be. We take this justice that remains in our society for granted. And judges should already possess all of the knowledge necessary to handle any situation that comes up in a courtroom. Aristotle says it's especially requisite that laws, which are rightly framed, should define all such particulars as can be defined, and leave very little to be defined by the judge. So the lawmakers have to do the work. They have to make things so clear and detailed that they take the power away from judges. And when the lawmakers can take the power away from judges, that actually prevents the opportunity for sophists to manipulate those judges. Good laws should be specific. They should specify as much as possible in advance, minimizing any subjective judgment by judges during trials. This promotes consistency, prevents arbitrary decisions based on these individual preferences or prejudices. Where we do see justice being perverted in modern society is where politics comes into play. We see this. We talk about conservative judges and liberal judges. Aristotle would have a heart attack if he saw this situation where you've got a judge who is going to judge in favor of his or her political preferences rather than according to an objective letter of the law. This is injustice present in our society. This is the kind of thing that Aristotle was talking about. The lawmakers have to take this power away from judges by specifying all the details in the published laws. Aristotle gives us 3 reasons, and these are really helpful, 3 reasons why laws need to be comprehensive. This should be self-evident, but he lays out 3 reasons for us, and it's very helpful for anyone who's interested in law or politics, and not just in government, but even in managing a household or running a business. You've got to make judgments and make decisions, and you've got to practice justice in any area of your life. Understanding these principles is not just valuable for politics or for a career in law, but just in any area of life where you want to manage something and do so with justice. He gives 3 reasons why laws, when we make rules and policies, why they should be comprehensive and detailed. He says, in the first place, it's necessary that laws should be specific because it's more easy to obtain one person, or maybe a few, that are intelligent and wise. It's easy to find one person, maybe a few, that are intelligent and wise. Whereas if you're going to leave justice to judges, you're going to need tons of wise, intelligent people, and they just don't exist. We see a good example of this in the scriptures. We see God sets Moses, who is the lawmaker, over the entire nation of Israel. Just one lawmaker can establish a law that directs a whole nation of peoples. We need just one intelligent man, just one wise and just man can establish a whole society filled with justice. So the first argument that Aristotle makes is just very practical. There aren't a lot of intelligent, wise, and just people. So society shouldn't be run by judges. It should be run by lawmakers. The same principle applies to education. There could be one curriculum maker. The curriculum should not be left to teachers. Same principle. You see how the general principle, if you understand it, can apply to other areas of life. So first reason, there just aren't lots of wise and intelligent people available to be judges. So it's better to have a few wise people, legislators, lawmakers, make the rules rather than rely on finding wise judges to fill every seat. The second argument he makes, why laws should be specific and comprehensive, is that the establishment of laws is the effect of a survey from a long series of past time. There's lots of deliberation that can go into the making of laws. But judgments made by judges are the result of a survey from recent times. It's made on the spot in a little bit of time where the judge only learns of the details of the case within hours or days, maybe weeks before the judgment needs to be made. And so we see a long time available for deliberation for lawmakers and the development of laws, but a short time for the development of a judgment by a judge. Laws result, as I said, from studying many cases over long periods. If you ever see photographs of lawyers in their offices, you'll see they've got these huge collections of books behind them. Usually those are all histories of cases that have been heard and judged on in the past, all of the laws and so on. All of these precedents, all of this history of legal problems and judgments and laws that were made and then amended and corrected and improved, that's the benefit of laws. It's the effect of a survey from a long series of past time and judgments. Laws have the advantage of broader experience and development, deeper reflection, and so on. It's better to have a city governed by laws than judges. The third reason, which Aristotle says is the greatest reason of all, is that the judgment of the lawmaker is not conversant with particulars. And we'll see what that means in just a second. It's not, the judgment of a lawmaker when he makes a law is not conversant with particulars, but with events that are going to take place in the future, things that don't directly even relate to him. Universal questions about justice. But the judgment of a judge in a specific case is directed to present circumstances with which the judge may become entangled. Things or people that he loves or hates, his own private advantages, may be tied up in a certain case. And so we can see that the lawmaker can be separate from the actual events, whereas the judge may be entangled in them because the cases involve particular people and situations, and they're local. These things take place where the judge lives. And so we can see that the judge may get caught up in the details of these cases. This is what creates emotional involvement in the case. This is what makes the judge vulnerable to these to this manipulation by these sophists, by these orators. Things he likes, dislikes, his own interests, his own relatives, effects on his family, fear fear of his own life, and so on. And we can avoid this, as Aristotle says, by making very little to be left to the power of the judges. So for all these reasons, judges should have the minimal power in determining the outcomes of legal cases, legal situations. Aristotle goes on and says, with respect to the inquiry whether a thing has been done or not, or whether it will or will not take place, or is not, it's not necessary that that should be left to the judges, for it's not possible that it is, these are the things that should be left to the judges. Let me just reread that. This is from Aristotle's text. With respect to the inquiry whether a thing has been done or not, these are the specific judgments that should be left to judges, whether a thing has been done or not, whether it will or will not take place, whether it is or is not. This kind of question should be left to the judges, for it's not possible that these things that actually take place or are said to have taken place, it's not possible that these questions could be answered by the legislator, these particular questions of fact, what actually happened, what actually exists, what will occur. These kinds of practical, particular, individual details, they need to be left to the judges, because the legislators can't see the future or, write, the judgments for particular cases when they make the laws. The laws are universal. The judgments are particular and local. That's the kind of stuff judges should be doing, looking at the evidence, deciding on whether or not the evidence proves the case in one way or the other. He says, if this is the case, it's evident that those rhetoricians who define other parts of an oration other than credibility, who aren't dealing with proof, but all other kinds of nonsense, Aristotle says, those rhetoricians exercise their art in things foreign to the purpose. That art has nothing to do with this and should be kept out of just society. We should be focused entirely on our arguments, the credibility, the evidence, and so on. That's really all that a judge should be dealing with. In these things, they affect nothing else except delivering the method by which the judge may be influenced. That's what they're teaching. They demonstrate nothing. Demonstrate meaning to prove. They prove nothing respecting artificial credibility. That is, they don't make any arguments or provide any evidence. They don't prove a case. They just try to manipulate the judge. Someone may become enthymematic or possess the power of discovering artificial proofs. If they study rhetoric truly, they can become enthymematic and possess the power of discovering artificial proofs. Discovering is a key word there, means to actually find persuasive arguments in a case. That's one of the great powers that a master orator has. He can just uncover lines of argument which others might not even imagine. A good example of this is the stories of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, by his, he always appeals to deductive reasoning. What makes Sherlock Holmes famous in the stories is that he is able to come up with arguments, logical arguments that reveal the truth of the cases which no one else is able to discover. That's the power of invention, is what it was actually called, the power to discover persuasive lines of argument. That should really be the goal of rhetoric, Aristotle says. The false teachers of fake rhetoric, they just show people how to influence judges, how to play games, how to manipulate people. They don't actually teach the students how to construct enthymemes, how to discover legitimate arguments about the matters that they're called upon to speak. That work, how to construct enthymemes, how to discover effective arguments. That should really be the focus of the art of rhetoric. And it's good for us to see this because we're getting an introduction to what we're going to be studying in this course. We're going to learn how to construct enthymemes and discover legitimate arguments. That's useful stuff. Aristotle goes on. Though there is the same method respecting popular and judicial orations, he talks about two different kinds of speeches. Popular, which obviously relates to the people, and judicial, which relates to the courts. The popular, he says, is better and more political than the method pertaining to contracts. But rhetoricians of the present day, that is Aristotle's day, they don't say anything about the popular orations, but all of them endeavor to unfold the art that pertains to the judicial genus, because it is less advantageous in popular orations to assert what is foreign to the purpose. In other words, they won't get away with their tricks when they speak in a popular oration, a speech before the people, concerning the people. Aristotle argues that a popular oration is less pernicious, less evil than a judicial discussion, but is more common. So although the same principles apply to both political speeches, and think about what political speeches seek to do. They seek to move an audience, to persuade an audience to move politically in a certain way, to make a certain judgment. The same principles apply to both political speeches and legal speeches. Political rhetoric is more noble. Aristotle says it's more political, more important than legal rhetoric. But the teachers that Aristotle opposes focus only on legal rhetoric. And you should ask yourself, why would that be? Why would they only be concerned with legal rhetoric? It's because irrelevant appeals, the kind of tricks and techniques that they use, are less effective in political settings. And political speeches are less harmful than legal speeches when they go wrong. But political rhetoric is more widely applicable. These fake rhetoric teachers are not interested in political speeches. They're interested in influencing judges. In the former, the judge decides about appropriate concerns so that nothing else is necessary but to show that a thing is as the counselor asserts it to be. In political speeches, the audience decides about matters that directly concern them. So the speaker needs to demonstrate that his claims are true. But in judicial processes, Aristotle says, this is not sufficient. It's requisite to pay attention to the hearer, for the decision is concerning things of a foreign nature. In legal cases, judges decide about matters that don't directly affect them personally. So speakers feel that they must manipulate the judge's attitudes rather than simply present the facts. That's an important point to think about. Judges often make judgments on cases that don't directly affect them. And so you can see that that can be a bad thing in one sense because it can entangle the judge in the outcome of a case. There's another aspect that's bad because the judge can make judgments without really thinking about the effects of those judgments. It can be unjust or not necessarily unjust, but unmerciful in a different direction. The judges, Aristotle says, looking to their own advantage, regarding their own pleasure, gratify the litigants, that is, the people speaking, and they don't decide with justice. The judges make decisions based on their own personal preferences or advantages to them, rather than making judgments strictly in the light of justice, because they're content to please those speaking rather than seeking the truth. And there are, again, reasons for this, which are worth thinking about. Hence, as I have observed before, Aristotle says, in many places the law forbids anything foreign to the purpose to be said, and in these places the law is sufficiently observed by the judges themselves. Many jurisdictions, many different areas, Aristotle says, prohibit this kind of irrelevant speech. And judges in those places enforce those restrictions. That's how the courts need to be run. They recognize in their laws the corrupting effect of emotional appeals, manipulation. Aristotle continues. He says, since, however, it's evident that the artificial method is conversant with credibility, the artificial method that we're actually interested in rhetoric is conversant with credibility. It deals with proof. Credibility, however, if we ask what is credibility, it's a certain kind of demonstration, a proof. We especially believe in a thing, Aristotle says, when we think it's accompanied with demonstration or proof. When we think something can be proven, we believe it. A rhetorical demonstration is an enthymeme. And this kind of enthymeme, Aristotle says, possesses the greatest authority of all credibilities, of all kinds of proof. An enthymeme is a certain kind of syllogism, and it is the province either of the whole or of a certain part of the art of dialectic to pay attention to every syllogism. So if you're interested in dialectic, you respect the art of dialectic or logic, you must be concerned with the enthymeme, which is a kind of syllogism. And that means you must be concerned with this art of rhetoric. This being the case, he says, it's evident that he who is eminently capable of surveying this, from what propositions and how a syllogism may be made, he will be especially enthymematic. He will be capable of discovering proofs and making and testing effective arguments. In consequence of assuming what the particulars are with which enthymemes are conversant. So his mastery of the art of dialectic will sharpen the sword, as it were, and make him capable in the field of rhetoric. He will be able to identify the particulars with which enthymemes are conversant and what differences they possess with respect to logical syllogisms. Now he's changing here. He's moving from this defense of rhetoric he was giving before to beginning to get to the art that he wants to teach in this book. He explains that there is a positive foundation for rhetoric. He says that true rhetorical art focuses on credibility. This depends on demonstration or proof. He says that we believe things when we think that they've been proven or that they can be proven. He says that rhetoric uses demonstration, which is what makes it persuasive. It uses a certain kind of demonstration, enthymemes, and that these are the most authoritative form of rhetorical proof. They're a certain kind of syllogism. And since dialectic studies all syllogisms, those who study and are skilled in dialectical reasoning will excel at constructing enthymemes, so long as they understand how rhetorical syllogisms differ from purely logical ones. So when he talks about purely logical syllogisms, he's talking about arguments that are used to prove things in, let's say, the philosophical sciences, the kinds of proofs that Thomas Aquinas might use in the Summa Theologica, the types of proof that Aristotle himself uses when he's teaching physics or metaphysics. Those are a different kind of argument, a different kind of syllogism. Rhetorical syllogisms differ from those. And so this, again, reciprocates, was the word that he used, is counterpart to the art of dialectic, and is itself a separate art. So this is the foundation, the right foundation, Aristotle argues, for the art of rhetoric. It's to study a certain kind of syllogism, an enthymeme, and to become skillful in developing enthymemes and in discovering effective rhetorical syllogisms. That's the goal of the art. So here we have a positive goal, the mission for this study in rhetoric. He says it's the province of the same power in man to perceive what is true and, notice this difference he makes, this comparison, to perceive what is true and to perceive what is similar to truth, that is, what's probable. At the same time, men are by nature, this is a questionable statement Aristotle makes here, an assumption about human nature. He says, men are by nature sufficiently adapted to the perception of truth. Men have an inclination to the truth, he says, and for the most part, they usually obtain it. Unless there's a reason, men usually are able to discern what's true. He says the same mental faculty or the same natural power that recognizes what's true also recognizes something that resembles the truth, something that's probable. He says that humans are naturally equipped to perceive truth and generally succeed in doing so. Now, this is important because it shows the importance of the art of rhetoric. The audience is looking for and is inclined to the truth. And so the rhetorician, the speaker who has the truth on his side, has the advantage. And the art of rhetoric is the means by which he maintains that advantage. He doesn't give it away by inferior skill to someone who actually doesn't have the truth, but can make his case appear deceptively, appear to be true when in fact it's false. The only way that men, he's saying, can be led to not discern the truth is when they're deceived. So the same faculty that recognizes what is true in man also is able to recognize what resembles truth, and probability can be sufficient, which is the goal of rhetoric. This shows that rhetoric, which deals with probable truth, builds on and relates to natural human capacities. So this interest in probability, you can imagine, and this may be what Aristotle was dealing with. You have hardcore truth seekers, hardcore philosophers who like to argue demonstratively. They like to start with absolute truths. Let's take a geometrician, for example. He likes to start with definitions and axioms. Assume nothing. Nothing there is probable. Everything is certain. And Aristotle starts talking about these kinds of cases and speeches and courts and political speeches. And you can imagine a philosopher saying, I'm not interested in that stuff. I'm interested in the truth. I want absolute truth. And Aristotle is arguing here and saying, like, look, if you're interested in truth, you also need to be interested in what appears or what is similar to the truth, what's probable, not just what is absolutely certain. We also have a responsibility to fight for what is probable, even when it can't be demonstratively proven. And there's a lot to talk about with reasoning. The difference between demonstrative reasoning, which we learn in Aristotle's analytics, the prior and posterior analytics, as opposed to dialectical reasoning, which we learn in Aristotle's topics. Realize that the analytics, demonstrative reasoning applies to philosophical sciences. But dialectical reasoning, which we study in topics, that applies to rhetorical applications. That has to do with rhetoric. So Aristotle is really saying, like, look, this is all just different parts of the same system. It's all different parts of the same concern we have for truth and justice. We can't decide which kind of argument we're going to concern ourselves with and then ignore others, which are just as important, maybe even more influential in everyday life. We've got to do both. We've got an obligation not only to pursue truth for ourselves through contemplation, for example, but we're also responsible for the happiness of our neighbor. That's what the political science is all about. And it's going to lead us into lots of controversies that need to be settled by probabilities. He goes on to say, hence, he who sagaciously conjectures probabilities, some complicated language there, sagaciously conjectures probabilities is disposed similarly to him who perceives the truth. Someone who is skilled at judging what is probable is not useless, as a philosopher might be tempted to think. Someone who can judge, who can sagaciously, that means wisely or cunningly, conjecture probabilities, judge probabilities, has the same kind of intellectual ability as someone who grasps the truth, a philosopher. This, again, for Aristotle, validates rhetoric's concern with probable reasoning. It's not just nonsense. It's a legitimate intellectual activity, a legitimate and necessary study. Others, therefore, artificially discuss things far into the purpose, again, the fake teachers, and why they especially incline to judicial precepts is evident from what has been said. Rhetoric is useful, Aristotle says, because things that are true and just are naturally more excellent than their contraries. Unless judgments are formed according to what is fit, what is more excellent may be vanquished by its contrary. And this is a thing worthy of reprehension. We should be afraid of the possibility that the truth, or what is more excellent or more beautiful, could be defeated because of the skill of a speaker or because of the lack of skill in a speaker. We should be concerned that what is true and excellent and beautiful should always be victorious. And that will naturally happen as long as we don't screw things up. But it's possible for us to screw things up, Aristotle is saying. And that's why we've got to take this art seriously. He defends rhetoric's usefulness with a number of different arguments. First, he says, truth and justice, and these are universal principles that apply throughout life and are very important. Truth and justice are naturally stronger than falsehood and injustice. Truth and justice are naturally stronger than falsehood and injustice. But if people don't judge properly, the weaker position can defeat the stronger position, the better, the truer position. True religion, for example, a just law, a just, a person who's falsely accused may be condemned because the litigant fails to present the evidence in the case. And Aristotle says this would be blameworthy. This would be shameful. And so we need to study rhetoric to ensure that truth and justice always prevail. Farther still, he says, though we should possess the most accurate science, the most accurate knowledge, it's not easy when we speak to persuade some people by employing that science. So just because you're smart and you know your science and you're an expert, blah, 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 he says, look, it often comes down to persuading people. And the knowledge of your science is not going to be useful when the audience doesn't know the principles of your science. Sometimes we've got to find other kinds of arguments to persuade an audience. He says, a scientific oration proceeds from discipline or study. It's impossible from such a source, from a science, to persuade unlearned people. But it's necessary when we address the unlearned to procure credibility, to persuade them, to prove our point. And we've got to be able to frame arguments from things that are common, from common knowledge. And he says, just as we have asserted in the topics, that's where we study this skill. So you can't just be a nerd with your expertise, because if the audience is not persuaded that the discoveries of your science are true, they're not going to care if you make arguments from that science. Now, we can see a number of good examples of this in history. Just right off the top of my head, Aesop, in his fables, Aesop makes persuasive moral arguments by telling stories about common animals, common experiences, things common in our natural lives. Aesop is not doing that because he's interested in entertaining children. Aesop is doing that because he is seeking to discover means by which common people can be persuaded. There's very great wisdom in Aesop's fables. They demonstrate this rhetorical power that Aristotle is talking about. Another example is found in the parables of our Lord. We see our Lord, think about it, the incarnate Son of God coming down from heaven to make God's will known. He's speaking of things that we cannot possibly know, and he comes down from heaven. He says, no one has ever seen God, but the Son of God, who dwells in the presence of God the Father, he explains him. We read this in the Gospel of John. He says to, I think it's Nicodemus, he says, how can you believe if I speak of earthly things and you don't believe or don't understand? How will you believe if I speak to you of heavenly things, which you're totally unfamiliar with? And you see, this is the dilemma. And so we see in our Lord's teaching, he uses parables, stories, to communicate these mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. And he does so in a way that the people who he describes in the Beatitudes, the virtuous people, the poor in spirit, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they will be able to understand his parables. But the fakers, the hypocrites, they won't be able to understand them. He speaks in a way that the unlearned are able to understand. He persuades the unlearned by using arguments from things as are common, as Aristotle describes here. So disappearing into your sciences is not sufficient for persuasion. He goes on and says, farther still, the power of being able to persuade contraries, to argue on both sides of an issue, or the ability to dispute on each side of a question is necessary. This exercise, this ability, it's necessary in the same manner as in syllogisms, not because we want to actually do this. We're never going to actually argue a false position, a position we know to be untrue. That would be morally wrong, Aristotle says. But we need to do this in order to understand how opposing arguments work, so that we can refute them when others use them unjustly. We've got to learn both sides of the arguments. In modern Christian culture, we see that many Christians just copy and paste arguments that are commonly known and passed around. They really don't even make an effort to understand what the opponent they're arguing with says or thinks. And many of the arguments that they copy and paste, they're not even relevant. They don't even address the ideas or the beliefs of their opponents. And their opponents know this, and they look at it and say, you don't even seem to understand what I believe or what I'm talking about. You just copy and paste these things like a robot. It's not persuasive at all. It doesn't matter that you copy and paste this argument. It's not even persuasive, not even relevant. You've got to study to understand both sides so that you can actually discover effective arguments that address the problems with other people's ideas or beliefs. You've got to understand their arguments because you'll actually learn how to refute their arguments when you properly understand them. I always used to tell my students in debate classes, the topic that you're debating is often not the important topic. The debates often reveal other issues that are deeper, issues that are hidden under the surface. Those are the real issues. And one of the great benefits of debating a lot and just writing back and forth and arguing or even just reflecting on both sides of a question and different issues is that you can find these deeper, more influential, these crucial issues that actually are the real problem that need to be attacked. So Aristotle's explaining that this is part of the work of this study of the art of rhetoric. He says, no one of the other arts syllogistically concludes contraries. This alone is affected by dialectic and rhetoric. Both of them are similarly conversant with contraries, taking opposite sides of a question. Though the things which are the subjects of their consideration do not subsist similarly, but always, as I say, things which are true and naturally more excellent are more syllogistic, are more adapted to procure persuasion. He says, only dialectic and rhetoric can construct arguments for opposing positions. This doesn't mean that both sides are equally valid. The true and naturally superior positions, as he said, will always be more logical and persuasive than the false ones. We see a good example of this in Aquinas' Summa Theologica, where if we read the objections that he lists, which are false arguments, many of them sound really good. And that's a good thing to see, to realize that the arguments of other people actually are pretty impressive. And then we can read his refutations of those objections and see how carefully he takes them apart, identifies where they go wrong, and so on. That's the kind of skill that we want to have. St. Thomas for us is a model of this art of rhetoric. He says, criticizing this exercise, criticizing this study is just absurd. He says, it's absurd that it should be shameful for a man not to be able to give assistance to his body, and that it should not be shameful for him not to be able to assist himself by the reasoning power. In other words, if a man is going to war, no one would say it was a waste of time to train his body for war or to learn about the tactics of his opponents and specifically prepare himself to fight against them. No one would consider that to be silly, but when we talk about doing that mentally, everybody acts like that's a dumb idea. That makes no sense. Of course, we need to study the opponent's views and develop arguments and understand the arguments on both sides. Just as we're concerned with protecting ourselves physically, we should be even more concerned about developing our rational capacities, and we should do this through these rhetorical studies. He says, if it should be objected that he who uses unjustly rhetorical power, we could say, well, people use this to manipulate people or to deceive people. Therefore, we shouldn't study rhetoric because we may injure other people. He said, this objection can be made for everything that's good. This is the argument that we hear when we talk about whether guns should be legal. We say, well, guns can be used to kill people. So can rocks. So can cars. He said, that's true of every good thing. Every good thing can be misused. So we can't admit that as a reason not to study rhetoric, because some people might learn it and then use it to actually, persuade people of things that are false. That's true of any good thing. He says, he who uses things of this kind justly may benefit others in the greatest degree by using them justly, or by using them unjustly, I should say. He may affect the greatest injury. That's just how life works. The most beneficial things are also potentially the most harmful things when they're misused. This doesn't make them bad. It just makes proper use more important. I heard J.D. Vance, our vice president, just answer a question with that argument today, which was pretty good. He was asked, if we are sending military officers into the streets, military soldiers into the streets to stop crime, what happens when a bad politician, a tyrant, takes power, and we've established this precedent of using the military to arrest and punish citizens? And J.D. Vance said, look, we can't use what bad politicians are going to do to determine what good politicians should do. We need to do what's good. Any good thing can be misused. So that's what Aristotle's arguing here in response to that objection to rhetoric. He says, it's likewise evident. I'm sorry, I skipped one part. He says, rhetoric is not conversant with any one certain definite genus, but resembles in this respect dialectic. It is useful in many different ways. He says that rhetoric, like dialectic, it doesn't belong to any single specialized field, but it applies to all. It applies to every field, and therefore it's genuinely useful. He goes on, it's likewise evident that the employment of rhetoric is not to persuade. This is a confusing point for many students. Many people will say that if asked what is the art of rhetoric, they'll say it's the art of persuasion, learning how to persuade people. Aristotle makes it clear that that is not the goal of rhetoric. This is an important lesson. He says it's evident that the employment or use of rhetoric is not to persuade, but to perceive on every subject what is adapted to procure persuasion, in the same manner as in all other arts. The goal of rhetoric is not to persuade, but to perceive on every subject what is adapted to procure persuasion, to discover what is genuinely persuasive in any given situation. He gives an illustration of this, which he goes on to describe. He says, it's not the business of medicine to produce health. We don't judge a doctor, or we shouldn't judge a doctor by whether his patients all become healthy. That's really not in his power. What makes a good physician, what makes a good doctor, is that he knows every possible solution that exists, which may bring about the recovery of his patient, and he exhausts them all in diagnosing and treating the problem. He knows what the causes may be. He examines them all. He knows what every possible treatment may be, and he is able to find whatever may procure healing, what may bring a person back to health. However, there's lots of things that get in the way. For example, the patient may not listen to the doctor's advice. The patient's body may not respond well to the treatment. In God's providence, the person may simply not be appointed to recover. So there's much more involved in the healing art than just accurately diagnosing and prescribing what would be the proper treatment for the problem. We judge a physician based on whether he does the work of a physician well, not by the outcome in his patient. And Aristotle is saying rhetoric is like that. It's not that we're seeking to persuade as if that's in our control. Men have free will. There are lots of different influences on their decision-making. What marks a great rhetorician is whether he is conscious of all of the means of persuasion and makes exhaustive use of them in his attempt to effectively persuade the audience. But he's judged for his skill, not for the outcome, which is in the audience's control. He says, likewise, in addition to what has been said, it's the province of the same power to perceive what is persuasive and what appears to be so, just as it is the province of dialectic to discern what is true and to discern what is only an apparent syllogism. The same intellectual ability that recognizes genuine persuasion also recognizes false persuasion, just as dialectical skill, which men value, enables us to distinguish valid from invalid arguments. The sophistical art, the art of sophistry, which is deceptive reasoning, does not consist in the power of reasoning, Aristotle says. The sophistical art, which is what the rhetorical schools were actually teaching. The sophistical art does not consist in the power of reasoning, but in deliberate choice. Except that here, in the rhetorical art, one man will be a rhetorician from science and another from deliberate choice. Sophistry, which he's talking about here, he talks about this in the last book of the Organon, Sophistical Refutation. Sophistry results from trying to deceive people rather than from any lack of logical ability. It's a moral issue. In rhetoric, one person might be a genuine rhetorician through his scientific knowledge, his systematic study of the art of rhetoric, while another person may be a false rhetorician who's just trying to manipulate people. So what distinguishes these two, the sophist from the true rhetorician, Aristotle says, is the intention. Their intention is what is the difference, not the art of rhetoric. Don't blame rhetoric. It's just the individual intention. Again, the same is true of a knife. One person uses a knife to cut and prepare food to give someone health. Another person uses a knife to kill someone. The knife itself, or the skill of using the knife, is not responsible for the evil use of it. He concludes and says, this brings us to the end of this lesson, he says, there, however, namely in dialectic or logic, the sophist is from deliberate choice, but the logician is not from deliberate choice, but from the power of reasoning. In dialectic, which can again be used for good or evil, the sophist chooses to use fallacious arguments, false arguments, deceptions, uses his skill in dialectic to discover and use false arguments which are difficult to discern, while the true logician succeeds by reasoning truly and validly. The distinction between the good and the bad reasoner, like the good and the bad orator, is in the intention of the person. The distinction between proper and improper use, which is used to criticize rhetoric, would also apply to dialectic. So this is the end of Aristotle's first chapter, and it's quite a lengthy, important, and detailed chapter. And, we've gotten through it in an hour and 30 minutes. So that's all the content in the chapter. And now it's time for you as a student to go and read that chapter, study it, divide the chapter, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, and make sure that you understand every sentence in the lesson. That's the goal of studies. What I'd like to do to finish off here is leave you with 10 points worthy of memorization. So 10 points for memory work, key concepts that are worth memorizing. You might want to write these down. Number 1, rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic and deals with common human concerns. Rhetoric reciprocates with dialectic and deals with common human concerns. Number 2, all people naturally participate in rhetorical and dialectical activities. All people naturally participate in rhetorical and dialectical activities. Number 3, rhetoric can be systematized into a teachable art. Rhetoric can be systemized into a teachable art. Number 4, credibility through rational argument is the heart of the rhetorical art. Credibility through rational argument is the heart of rhetorical art. Number 5, enthymemes. Take some time to learn to spell it. Enthymemes are rhetorical syllogisms and the most important form of rhetorical proof. Enthymemes are rhetorical syllogisms and the most important form of rhetorical proof. Number 6, contemporary rhetoricians, or rhetoricians contemporary to Aristotle, let's say ancient rhetoricians, wrongly focus on emotional manipulation rather than logical demonstration. Ancient rhetoricians wrongly focused on emotional manipulation rather than logical demonstration. Number 7, good laws should define as much as possible to minimize subjective judgment. Good laws should define as much as possible to minimize subjective judgment. Number 8, rhetoric is useful because truth and justice are naturally stronger than their contraries. Rhetoric is useful because truth and justice are naturally stronger than their contraries. Number 9, rhetoric helps communicate scientific knowledge to general audiences. Rhetoric helps communicate scientific knowledge to general audiences. And 10th, the purpose of rhetoric is to discover persuasive means, not to guarantee persuasion. The purpose of rhetoric is to discover persuasive means, not to guarantee persuasion. So that's recommended memory work for this lesson. So in this class, we've studied chapter 1 of book 1 of Aristotle's Rhetoric. We've discussed the relationship between rhetoric and dialectic. We've talked about the importance of enthymemes as rhetorical proofs. We've seen Aristotle's critique of emotional manipulation in rhetoric, that's not proper for rhetoric. And we've seen Aristotle's 4 arguments for the usefulness of rhetoric in the service of truth and justice. As I said, it's time for you now to reread and study the lesson for yourself, develop your understanding of the lesson, and demonstrate that understanding through the graded assessments that are provided in the Academy's Classical Reasoning course. If you have any questions or need any more help with this lesson, please visit the Academy Help Center at classicalliberalarts.com/support. Once again, my name is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I hope that this lesson, as long as it might be, has been helpful. God bless your studies.